Chapter 17 of Murder at Bridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen. Chapter 17. It was nearly 9 o'clock Monday morning, and Special Investigator Dundee sat alone in the District Attorney's office, impatiently awaiting Sanderson's arrival. Coroner Price, with the approval of Captain Strawn of the Homicide Squad, had set the inquest into the murder of Juanita Leigh Selim for 10 o'clock, and there was much that Dundee wished to say to the District Attorney before that hour arrived. When the thoroughly tired and dispirited young detective had returned to his apartment late Sunday afternoon, after having seen Ralph Hammond completely exonerated of any possible complicity in the murder of Nita Selim, he had found a telegram from the District Attorney, filed in Chicago. Called Chicago, serious illness of mother. Stop. Returning Hamilton 8:10 Monday morning. Stop. See by papers you are on Selim job. Stop. Good, but watch your step. Sanderson. Well, and Dundee grinned ruefully, he had been on the job all right, but would Sanderson consider that he had watched his step? At any rate, he had been thorough, he congratulated himself, as he weighed the big manila envelope containing his own transcription of the copious shorthand notes he had taken during the first hours of the investigation. A smaller envelope held Nita's tell-tale checkbook, her amazing last will and testament, and the still more startling note she had written to Lydia Carr. The last two Dundee had retrieved from Carraway only this morning, after having submitted them to the fingerprint expert on Sunday. Carraway's report had rather dashed him at first, for it proved that no other hands than Nita's, and his own, of course, had touched either envelope or contents. But he was now content to believe that Nita herself had unsealed the envelope she had inscribed, to be opened in case of my death. Why? Had she been moved by an impulse to give a clue to the identity of the person to whom she stood in fear, but had stifled the impulse? Strawn had said, too, that the little rosewood desk had been in a fairly orderly condition before his big official hands had clawed through it in search of a clue or the gun itself. Well, Strawn had been properly chagrined when Dundee had produced the will and note. Why did she stick it away in a pack of new envelopes, if she wanted it to be found? Strawn had demanded irritably, and had not been appeased by Dundee's suggestion, because she did not want Lydia, in dusting the desk, to see it and be alarmed. Yes, he had been busy enough, but what actually had he to show for his industry? He had worked up 3 good cases, the first against Lydia Carr, the second against Dexter Sprague, and the third against Ralph Hammond, only to have them knocked to pieces almost as fast as he had conceived them. Of course Lydia Carr might be lying to give Sprague an alibi, but Dundee was convinced she was telling the truth, and that she hated Sprague too much to fake an alibi for him. Of course there was always Judge Marshall, but... Through the closed door came sounds which Dundee presently identified as connected with Penny Crane's arrival. The emphatic click of her heels, the quick opening and shutting of desk drawers. The downhearted young detective debated the question of taking his perplexities out to her, but decided against it. She probably wanted to hear no more of his theories, but was undoubtedly burning with righteous indignation against him because of Ralph Hammond. Did she still consider herself engaged to Ralph, in spite of the fact that young Hammond had gallantly insisted upon releasing her from her promise, as soon as he suspected that it had been given merely to prove her faith in his innocence? It was a decidedly unhappy young detective whom Sanderson greeted upon his arrival at 9 o'clock. The new district attorney, who had held office since November, was a big, good-natured, tolerant man who looked younger than his 35 years because of his freckles and his always rumpled mop of sandy hair. But those who sought to take advantage of his good nature in the courtroom found themselves up against as keen a lawyer and prosecutor as could be found in the whole state, or even in the Middle West. "Well, boy," he greeted Dundee genially, but with an undertone of solemnity in his rich, jury-swaying baritone. "Looks like we've got a sensational murder on our hands. It's not every day Hamilton can rate a headline like 'Broadway Belle Murdered at Bridge,' to quote a Chicago paper, but I'm afraid there's not enough mystery in it to suit your tastes." Dundee grinned wryly. "I've been pretty down in the mouth all morning because there's a little too much mystery, Chief." Fairly open and shut, isn't it? Sanderson asked, obviously surprised. New York gets too hot for this Selim baby. Probably mixed up with some racketeer. Racketeers being the favorite boyfriends of Broadway belles, if one can believe the tabloids. Lois Dunlap offers her a job to organize a little theater in Hamilton, which the fair Nita would certainly have described as a hick town, and which she wouldn't have been found dead in if she could have helped it. And the district attorney grinned at his own witticism. But Broadway Nita jumps at it. Her racketeer sweetie has a long arm, however, and Nita gets hers. Justly enough, probably, but I wish to the Lord she had chosen some other town to hide in. Lois Dunlap is the finest woman in Hamilton, but she's too damned promiscuous in her friendships. As it is now, some of the best friends I have in the world are mixed up in this mess, even if it is only as innocent victims of circumstance. Until then, Dundee had let his chief express his pent-up convictions without interruption, and indeed Sanderson's courtroom training had fitted him admirably for long speeches. But he could keep silent no longer. "That is what has been worrying me, Chief," he interrupted. "Captain Strawn has given the papers very little real information, but the truth is, I am afraid one of your friends was not an innocent victim of circumstance." District Attorney Sanderson sat down abruptly in the swivel chair at his desk. "Just what do you mean, Dundee?" "I mean, I am convinced that one of Mrs. Selim's guests was her murderer, but I'd like to tell you the whole story and let you judge for yourself." "My God!" Sanderson ejaculated. Slowly he drew out a handkerchief and mopped his freckled brow. "If I hadn't had a good many years of experience with criminals, Dundee, I'd say it is obvious on the face of it that none of those four men, Judge Marshall, Tracy Miles, Johnny Drake, Clive Hammond, could have committed such a cheap, sensational crime as murdering a hostess during a bridge game. Not that I haven't wanted to commit murder myself over many a game of bridge," he added, with the irrepressible humour for which he was famous. Then he groaned, the rueful twinkle still in his eye. "I'm afraid we're in for a lot of gruesome kidding. Why, last night, in the club car of my train, 3 tables of bridge players could scarcely play a hand for wisecracking about the dangers of being dummy. Well, boy, now that I've talked myself past the worst shock, suppose you give me the lowdown. But I'll warn you I'm going to take a powerful lot of convincing." Painstakingly, and in the greatest detail, Dundee told the whole story, beginning with his arrival Saturday evening at the Selim house, including the ghastly replaying of the death hand at bridge, a phrase, by the way, which the prosecutor instantly adopted, and ending with Ralph Hammond's establishing of an alibi, to the entire satisfaction of Captain Strawn, as well as of Dundee himself. He was interrupted frequently, of course, scoffingly at first, then with deepening solemnity and respect on the part of the district attorney. "Let me see the plan of the house again," he said, when Dundee had finished. "Also that table you've worked up showing the approximate time and order of arrival of the 4 men." "Thanks. You see, sir," Dundee repeated at last, "the list of possible suspects includes Lydia Carr, Dexter Sprague, John C. Drake, Judge Marshall, Polly Beale, Flora Miles, Janet Raymond, Clive Hammond—" "But Polly and Clive were in the solarium together all the time," Sanderson objected. "So they said," Dundee agreed. "But it is a very short trip from the solarium by way of the side porch into Nita's bedroom. And either Polly Beale or Clive Hammond could have made that trip, on the pretext of speaking to Nita about Ralph. Motive, murder to end blackmail. Naturally, such a theory would not include both of them, but if one of them was being blackmailed and made use of the pretext of warning Nita of Ralph's overwrought condition—" "Sprague's your man," Sanderson interrupted with relief. "Motive, jealousy because Nita was ditching him to marry Ralph. As for the gun and silencer, it seems pretty clear to me that Nita herself stole it from Judge Marshall, and that Sprague got it away from her. You say the maid, Lydia, went upstairs to tell Sprague he had to pack his things and take them away. For good. Very well. Sprague goes down the back stairs with the gun in his pocket, through the back hall into Nita's bedroom, shoots her, bumps into the lamp, goes out by the back door, and comes around front to join the party. You say yourself he has admitted to everything but the trip to Nita's room and the shooting, even to sneaking back to get his bag, which I believe also contained the gun until he had a chance to dispose of it on his way to his hotel in Hamilton." Dundee shook his head. I'd like to agree, Chief, but I believe Lydia is telling the truth. She says she was in the upstairs bedroom with Sprague and remained behind only 2 or 3 minutes at most, to put his shaving kit into the packaged bag, and to clean up the bathroom basin. On her way down the back stairs, she says she heard Lois Dunlap's second ring and went to answer it. Sprague and Janet Raymond, with whom Janet says he stopped to talk a minute on the front porch, were in the dining room before Lydia entered it. I'm convinced Lydia hates Sprague, and would be glad to believe him guilty. No, Mr. Sanderson, I don't believe Sprague did it, but I do believe it was Sprague's revenge that Nita was afraid of when she made her will Friday night. Naturally, she figured she'd have time to tell the person she was blackmailing that she was through with him. Or her, but I believe Sprague and Nita were lovers, even partners in blackmail, and that she feared he would kill her when he knew she was going to marry Ralph Hammond and give up their source of income. Sanderson considered for a long minute, pulling at his full lower lip. Well, thank God for those precious footprints Strawn is building on. Don't think I fail to follow your reasoning that the crime must have been committed in the bedroom, and not from the window sill, but those footprints may save us yet, and will certainly get us through the inquest. You agree, of course, that none of all this you've told me must be hinted at during the inquest? Good. Let's be going. It's nearly 10. Dundee's whole soul revolted at the very thought of the barbaric farce of an inquest. The small morgue chapel crowded to the doors with goggle-eyed, blood-loving humanity, the stretcher with its sheeted corpse, reporters avid of sensation and primed with questions which, if answered by indiscreet witnesses, would defeat the efforts of police and district attorney, news photographers with their insatiable cameras aimed at every person connected with the case in any way. Mercifully, this particular inquest upon the body of Juanita Leigh Selim promised to be quickly over. For Coroner Price, in conference with Sanderson, Dundee, and Captain Strawn, had gladly agreed to call only those witnesses and extract from them only such information as the authorities deemed advisable. Lydia Carr, whose black veil had defeated the news camera levelled at her poor scarred face, was the first witness called by Coroner Price, and she was required for the single purpose of identifying the body as that of her mistress. To 2 perfunctory questions, "Have you any information to give this jury regarding the cause and manner of the deceased's death?" and "Have you any personal knowledge of the identity of any person, man or woman, of whom the deceased stood in fear of her life?" Lydia answered a flat "No," and was then dismissed. Karen Marshall, looking far too young to be the wife of the elderly ex-judge, Hugo Marshall, was the second witness called. Dr. Price guided her gently to a brief recital of her discovery of the dead body of her hostess, emphasizing only the fact that, so far as she could see, the bedroom was unoccupied except by the corpse at the time of the discovery. He then handed her the photostatic copy of a blueprint of the ground floor of the Selim house, with a penciled ring drawn around the bedroom. Karen falteringly identified it, as well as the pencil-drawn furniture, and was immediately dismissed, to the packed rows of spectators and reporters. Dr. Price himself took the stand next, and described, in technical terms, the wound which had caused death and the caliber of the bullet he had extracted from the dead woman's heart. "I find also from the autopsy," he concluded, "that the bullet travelled a downward slanting path. I should add, moreover, that I have made exact mathematical calculations, using the position of the body and of the wound as a basis, and found that a line drawn from the wound, and extended at the correct slant, ends at a point 51.8 inches high upon the right-hand side of the frame of the window nearest the porch door." And he obligingly passed the marked blueprint among the jury. When it was in his own hands again, he added, "It is impossible to state the exact distance the bullet travelled, more nearly than to say the shot was fired along the line I have indicated, at a distance of not more than 15 feet and not less than 10. Captain Strawn rose and was permitted to question the witness. "Dr. Price, that blueprint shows that the bedroom is 15 feet in width, don't it?" "That is correct." "Have you also measured the height of that window sill from the floor?" "I have," the coroner answered. "The height from floor to sill is 26 inches. Now, doctor, from your calculations, would it be possible for a man crouching in the open window to fire a shot along the path you have calculated?" "It would," Dr. Price answered. "But as I have pointed out, it is impossible for me to say at exactly what distance from the body the shot was fired." But Strawn, of course, was amply satisfied. And so were Dundee and the district attorney, for it suited their purposes admirably for the public to be convinced at this time that an intruding gunman had murdered Nita Selim. Captain Strawn, sworn in, told briefly of his being called to the scene of the crime, of the activities of Carraway, the fingerprint expert, and of the exhaustive search of his squad of detectives. "Did you find any person concealed upon the premises, that is, within the house itself, or in the garage or on the grounds?" Dr. Price asked. "No, sir." "Did you or your men discover the weapon with which the deceased was killed?" "No, sir." "Did you question all persons in the house at the time of the crime, as to whether or not a shot had been heard?" "I did. The answer in every case was that they heard no shot." "And you also questioned every person present in an effort to place responsibility for the death of Mrs. Selim?" "I did. I couldn't find that anyone present had anything to do with it." "Who were those persons?" Dr. Price then asked. "Judge and Mrs. Hugo Marshall, Mr. and Mrs. Tracy A. Miles, Mr. and Mrs. John C. Drake, Mrs. Peter Dunlap, Miss Janet Raymond, Miss Polly Beale, Miss Penelope Crane, Mr. Clive Hammond, Mr. Dexter Sprague of New York, and Mrs. Selim's maid, Lydia Carr," Captain Strawn answered promptly, rolling out the names of Hamilton's elect with sonorous satisfaction, which obviously had the desired effect in convincing the jury that not among those proud names, at least, could be found the name of the murderer. "Did you find on the premises any clue which you consider of importance to this jury?" "I did! A bunch of footprints under the window you've been talking about. Here are life-size photographs of 'em, Doctor, and the rambler rose vines that climb up the outside of the window had been torn." After the photographs had been duly inspected by the jury of 6, Dr. Price said: "That is all, and thank you, Captain Strawn. Mr. Dundee?" As had been agreed between the coroner and the district attorney, Dundee's testimony, after the preliminary questions, was confined to the offering of Nita Selim's last will and testament and the note to Lydia. The reporters, who had obviously feared that nothing new would eventuate, sat up with startled interest; then their pencils flew as Dundee read the 2 documents, after he had told when and where he had discovered them. As District Attorney Sanderson had said, "Better give the press something new to chew on, but for God's sake don't mention that checkbook of Nita's. It's dynamite, boy, dynamite." While the morgue chapel was still in a buzz of excitement, Dundee was dismissed, and District Attorney Sanderson requested an adjournment of the inquest for 1 week. The police were urging the crowd upon its way before it became fully aware that it had been cheated out of the pleasure of hearing, at first hand, the stories of that fatal bridge and cocktail party from the guests themselves. "Tell the car woman I want to speak to her," Sanderson directed Dundee. "She'll thank you for rescuing her from the reporters." As Dundee pushed his way through the jam he heard a reporter earnestly pleading with Lois Dunlap. "But I'm sure you can remember the cards each player held in that death hand, Mrs. Dunlap." Cheerfully sure that he could trust Lois Dunlap's discretion and distaste for publicity, Dundee went on, grinning at the reporter's use of his own lurid phrase. 2 minutes later Sanderson, Strawn, and Dundee were closeted in Dr. Price's own office with Lydia Carr. "First, Lydia," began Sanderson, "I want to warn you to give the reporters no information at all regarding the nature or extent of your mistress's bequest." "It was little enough she had, poor girl, beyond her clothes and a few pieces of jewelry," Lydia answered stubbornly. "Are you going to let me do what she told me to do in that note? Not that I hold with burning. I see no reason why you should not take charge of the body, Lydia, and arrange it immediately for cremation. Do you, Captain Strawn?" "No, sir, the quicker the better." "Then, Lydia, if Captain Strawn will send you out to the Selim house with one of his boys, you may get the dress described in Mrs. Selim's note." "And the curls she cut off, and had made into switches," Lydia interrupted. "I can't dress my poor girl's hair in a French roll without them." "The curls, too," Sanderson agreed. "Now as to the cremation " "Mrs. Miles let me come in early to see about that," Lydia interrupted again. "They can do it this afternoon, and you don't need to worry about the expense. I've got money enough of my own to pay my girl's funeral expenses." "Good!" Sanderson applauded. "The will shall be probated as soon as possible, of course, but it makes it simpler if you will pay the necessary expenses now." "Just a minute, Chief," Dundee halted the district attorney as he was about to leave. "Under the circumstances I think it highly advisable that we get pictures of the burial dress. I suggest you have Lydia bring the things to your office before she lays out the body, and that Carraway photographed the dress there, from all angles. I should also like to have a picture of the body after Lydia has finished her services." The maid's scarred face flushed a deep, angry red, but she offered no protest when the district attorney accepted both of Dundee's suggestions. "Then you'll have Carraway with his camera at my office in about an hour?" Sanderson turned to Captain Strawn. "Let's say 12 o'clock. By the way, Lydia, you may bring in with you the few pieces of jewelry you mentioned. I'll keep them safely in my offices until the will is probated and they are turned over to you." "I don't know where she kept them," Lydia answered. "What?" exclaimed Bonnie Dundee. "I said, I don't know where she kept her jewelry," Lydia Carr retorted. "It wasn't worth much, not $100 altogether, I'll be bound, because Nita sold her last diamond not a week before we left New York. She owed so many bills then that the money she got for directing that play at the Forsyte School hardly made a dent on them." "Do you know whether the jewelry was kept in the house or in a safe deposit box?" Dundee asked, excitement sharpening his voice. "It must have been in the house, because she wore the different pieces any time she pleased," the maid answered. "I didn't ask no questions, and I didn't happen to see her get it out or put it away. I didn't ever do much lady's maid work for her, like dressing her or fixing her hair. Just kept her clothes and the house in order, and did what little cooking there was to do." "Her dressing table?" Dundee prodded. "Her desk?" The maid shook her head. "I was always straightening up the drawers in both her dressing table and her desk, and she didn't keep the jewelry in either one of them places." "Captain Strawn, when you searched the dressing table and desk for the gun or anything of importance, did you have any reason to suspect a secret drawer in either of them?" "No, Bonnie. They're just ordinary factory furniture. I tapped around for a secret drawer, of course, but there wasn't even any place for one," Strawn assured him with an indulgent grin. "I want to see Penny Crain!" Dundee cried, making for the door. "Then you'd better come along to the courthouse with me," Sanderson called after him. "I sent her back to the office as soon as the inquest was adjourned." The two men passed through the now deserted morgue chapel and almost bumped into a middle-aged man, obviously of the laboring class in spite of his slicked-up Sunday appearance. "You're the district attorney, ain't you, sir?" he addressed Sanderson in a nervous, halting undertone. "Yes. What is it?" "I come to the inquest to give some information, sir, but it was adjourned so quick I didn't have time " "Who are you?" Sanderson interrupted impatiently. "I'm Rawlins, sir. I worked for the poor lady, Mrs. Selim, gardening one day a week." "Come to my office," Sanderson commanded quickly, as a lingering reporter approached on a run. "No, no, I'm sorry, Harper," he said hastily, cutting into the reporter's questions. "Nothing new. You may say that the police have thrown out a dragnet," and he grinned at the trite phrase, "for the gunman who killed Mrs. Selim, and will offer a reward for the recovery of the weapon, a Colt's .32 equipped with a Maxim silencer. Come along, George, and I'll explain just what Mrs. Sanderson and I have in mind." The district attorney and Dundee strode quickly away, and the man Rawlins, after a moment of indecision, trotted after them. "I don't understand, sir, and my name ain't George, it's Elmer." "You don't have to understand anything except that you're not to answer any questions that any reporter asks you," Sanderson retorted. When the trio entered the reception room of the district attorney's suite in the courthouse, Sanderson paused at Penny Crain's desk. "Bring in your notebook, Penny. This man has some information he considers important." A minute later Sanderson had begun to question his voluntary but highly nervous witness. "Your name?" "It's Elmer Rawlins, like I told you, sir," the man protested, and flinched as Penny recorded his words in swift shorthand. "It was my wife as made me come. She said, as long as me and her knowed I didn't do nothin' wrong, I'd oughter come forward and tell what I knowed." "Yes, yes!" Sanderson encouraged him impatiently. "You say you worked for Mrs. Selim as gardener one day a week?" "Yes, sir, but I tended to her hot water and her garbage, too. Twice a day, it was, I had to go and stoke the little laundry heater that heats the hot water tank in summertime when the steam furnace ain't being used. I live about a mile beyont the Crain place, that is, the house the poor lady was killed in." "Did you come to stoke the laundry heater Saturday evening?" Dundee interrupted. "Excuse me, sir," he turned to the district attorney, "but this is the first time I've seen this man." "No, sir, I didn't stoke it Sat'day night," Rawlins answered uneasily. "You see, I was comin' up the road to do my chores at 6:30, like I always do, but before I got to the house I seen a lot of policemen's cars and motorcycles, and I didn't want to get mixed up in nothin', so I turned around and went home again. I didn't know what was up, but when me and the wife went into Hamilton Sat'day night in our flivver, we seen one of the extrys, and read about how the poor lady was murdered. But that ain't what I was gettin' at, sir. "Well, what are you gettin' at?" Sanderson urged. "Well, the extry said the police had found some footprints under the frontmost of them two side windows to Miss Selim's bedroom, and went on to talk about the rose vines being tore, and straight off I said to the missus, 'Them's my footprints, Minnie.' Minnie's my wife's name." "Your footprints!" Sanderson ejaculated, then shook with silent laughter. "There goes Strawn's case, Bonnie." But immediately he was serious again, as the import of this new evidence came to him. "Tell us about it, Rawlins. When did you make those footprints?" "Friday, sir. That's the day I gardened for Miss Selim. You see, sir, the poor little lady told me she was kept awake nights when they was a high wind, by the rose vines tapping against the windows. Says she, 'I think they's something trying to get into my room, Elmer.' And I could see the poor little thing was mighty nervous anyway, so I didn't waste no time. I cut away a lot of the rose vine, and burned it when I was burnin' the garbage and papers in the 'cinerator out back." "Is that all, Rawlins?" Sanderson asked. "'Bout all that mounts to anything," the labourer deprecated. "But they was somethin' else that struck me as a little funny, when I come to think of it." "Well?" Sanderson prodded, as the man halted uncertainly. "Well, it's like I told you, it was my job to burn the papers. That scar-faced maid of Miss Selim's put everything, garbage and trash, in a big garbage can outside the back door, and I burnt 'em up. So I was kinder surprised Saturday mornin', when I went to stoke up the laundry heater, to find somebody'd been meddlin' with my drafts and had let the fire go clean out. I had to clean out the ashes and build a new fire. You're tryin' to say, I suppose, that you could tell by the ashes that some one had been burning papers in the laundry heater?" Sanderson asked, with a quick glance at Dundee's tense face. "That's right, sir," Rawlins agreed eagerly. "You know what kind of ashes a mess of paper makes. Layers of white ashes, sir, that kind o' looks like papers yet." "Yes, I know. And you found layers of white ashes which you took particular pains to clean out?" Sanderson asked bitterly. "Yes, sir, so's I could build a new fire. Did you speak to the maid? Asked her if she'd been meddlin' with your drafts?" "Yes, sir, I did," the man answered with a trace of the belligerence he had undoubtedly shown to Lydia. "She said she didn't open no dampers, claimed the heater was the same as usual when she left Friday night to go to a movie. So I reckon it was the poor lady herself, burnin' up love letters, maybe, or some such truck." "You're to keep your reckons to yourself, Rawlins," Sanderson cut in emphatically. "Remember now, you're not to tell anybody else what you've just told me. If that's all, you can go now, and I'm much obliged to you. Leave your address with the young lady here. You'll be needed later, of course." The relieved man hurried out of the room on Penny's heels. Sanderson shrugged, then, when the door had closed, began heavily: "It looks like you're right, Bonnie, about that blackmail business. As the astute Rawlins says, love letters, maybe, or some such truck. Of course, it all fits in with your theory that Nita had made up her mind to reform, marry Ralph Hammond, and be a very good girl indeed. All right, you can have Penny in now. I think I know pretty well what you're going to ask her. And I may as well tell you that when Roger Crain skipped town with some securities he was known to possess, he hadn't got them from a safe deposit box, because he didn't have one," and Sanderson pressed a button on the edge of his desk. "Penny, do you know whether there is a concealed safe in the Selim house?" The girl, startled, began to shake her head, then checked herself. "Not that I ever saw, or knew of when Dad and Mother and I lived there, but " She hesitated, her cheeks turning scarlet. "Out with it, Penny," Sanderson urged, his voice very kind. "It's just that, if you really think there's a secret hiding place in the house, I believe I understand something that puzzled me when it happened," Penny confessed, her head high. "I was at the country club one night, a Saturday night when the whole crowd is usually there for dinner and dance. I'd been dancing with Ralph, and when the music stopped we went out on the porch, where several of our crowd were sitting. It was just 2 or 3 weeks after Dad left town. Lois wouldn't let me drop out of things. Anyway, it was dark, and I heard Judge Marshall saying something about the simplest and most ingenious arrangement you ever saw. Of course, that's where the rascal kept his securities. I knew they were talking about Dad, from the way Judge Marshall shut up and changed the subject as soon as he saw me." "Who was on the porch, Penny?" Dundee asked tensely. "Why, let's see. Flora, and Johnny Drake, and Clive," she answered slowly. "I think that was all, besides Judge Marshall. The others hadn't come out from dancing. Of course I don't know whether or not it was some arrangement in the house " "Where are you going, boy?" Sanderson checked Dundee, who was already on his way to the door. To find that gun, of course." "Well, if it's tucked away in the simplest and most ingenious arrangement you ever saw, it will stay put for a while," Sanderson said. "Lydia's due here within half an hour, and you don't want to miss her, do you?" End of chapter 17.
Bridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stefanie König. Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen. Chapter 18. It was exactly 12 o'clock when Lydia Carr, accompanied by Detective Collins of the Homicide Squad carrying a small suitcase, arrived at the District Attorney's office. "I kept my eye on her every minute of the time to see that there wasn't no shenanigans," Collins informed Dundee and Sanderson importantly, callous to the fact that the maid could hear him. "But I let her bring along everything she said she needed to lay the body out in. Was that right?" "Right," agreed the district attorney as Dundee opened the suitcase upon Sanderson's desk. The royal blue velvet dress lay on top, neatly folded. Dundee shook out its folds. It looked remarkably fresh and new, in spite of the years it had hung in Nita Selim's various clothes closets, preserved because God alone knew what tender memories. Perhaps the beautiful little dancer had intended all those years that it should be her shroud. "Oh, it's lovely!" Penny Crane, who was looking on, cried out involuntarily. "It looks like a French model." "It's a copy of a French model. You can see by the label on the back of the neck," Lydia answered, her one good eye softening for Penny. "So it is," Dundee agreed, and took out his penknife to snip the threads which fastened the white satin, gold-lettered label to the frock. "Pierre model, copied by Simonson's, New York City," he read aloud, and slipped the little square of satin into the envelope containing the murdered woman's will. "Well, Penny, I'm glad you like the dress, for I'm going to ask you to do the mannequin stunt in it as soon as Carraway arrives with his camera." Penny turned very pale, but she said nothing in protest, and Dundee continued to unpack the suitcase. His masculine hands looked clumsy as they lifted out the costume slip and miniature dancing set brassiere and step-ins, all matching, of filmiest white chiffon and lace. His fingers flinched from contact with a switch of long, silky black curls. "She bought them after we came to Hamilton," Lydia informed him, pointing to the undergarments. "Them black moire pumps and them French stockings are brand new, too. 100 gauge silk them stockings are, and never on her feet." "Ready for me?" Carraway had appeared in the doorway, with camera and tripod. "Yes, Carraway. Just the dress, Penny. I want full-length front, back and side views of Miss Crane wearing this dress, Carraway. Flashlights, of course. Better take the pictures in Miss Crane's office," Dundee directed. "You stay here, Lydia. I want to talk with you while that job is being done." "Yes, sir," Lydia answered, and accepted without thanks the chair he offered. "I suppose you have read the Hamilton Morning News today, Lydia?" "I have. May I have that paper, Chief? Thanks. Now, Lydia, I want you to read again the paragraphs that are headed 'New York, May 25th,' and tell us if the statements are correct." Lydia accepted the paper, and her single eye scanned the following lines obediently. "New York, May 25th, UP. Miss Juanita Leigh Selim, who was murdered Saturday afternoon in Hamilton, was known along Broadway as Nita Leigh, chorus girl and specialty dancer. Her last known address in New York was number blank, West 54th Street, where she had a 3-room apartment. According to the superintendent, E.J. Black, Miss Leigh, as he knew her, lived there alone except for her maid Lydia Carr, and entertained few visitors. Irving Vine, publicity director for Altamont Pictures, when interviewed by a reporter in his rooms at the Cadillac Hotel late today, said that Nita Leigh had been used for bits and as a dancing double for stars in a number of recent pictures, including Nightlife and Boy Howdy, both of which have dancing sequences. Musical comedy programs for the last year carry her name only once, in the list of ladies of the ensemble of the revue What of It? Miss Eloise Pendleton, head mistress of Forsyte on the Hudson, mentioned in the dispatches from Hamilton, confirms the report that Mrs. Selim, as she was known there, twice directed the annual Easter musical comedy presented by that fashionable school for young ladies, but could add nothing of interest to the facts given above, beyond asserting that Mrs. Selim had proved to be an unusually competent and popular director of their amateur theatricals. "Yes, that's correct as far as it goes," Lydia commented, resentment strong in her harsh voice, as she returned the paper to Dundee. "Have you anything to add?" Dundee caught her up quickly. "No, sir." Lydia shook her head, her lips in a grim line. Then resentment burst through. "They don't have to talk like she was a back number on Broadway just because she was tired of the stage and going in for movies." District Attorney Sanderson took her in hand then, pelting her with questions about Nita's New York gentleman friends, but he made no more headway than Dundee. "We know that Nita Selim was afraid of someone," Sanderson began again, angrily. "Who was it? Someone she'd known in New York? Or somebody in Hamilton?" "I don't know," Lydia told him flatly. "But you do know she was living in fear of her life, don't you?" Dundee interposed. Well, yes, I suppose she was," Lydia admitted reluctantly. "But I thought she was just afraid to live out there in that lonesome house away off at the end of nowhere." "Was she afraid of Dexter Sprague?" Sanderson shot at her. "Would she have asked him to stay all night if she had been afraid of him?" Lydia demanded scornfully. "And would she have asked him to rig up a bell from her bedroom to mine if it was him she was afraid of?" "A bell?" Dundee echoed. "Yes, sir. It has a contraption under the rug, right beside her bed, so's she could step on it and it would ring in my room, which was underneath hers. Mr. Sprague bought the wire and stuff, bored a hole through her bedroom floor, and fixed it all hisself." "Did anyone know Nita had taken this precaution to protect herself?" Dundee asked. "Miss Lewis did, because one day not long ago she stepped on it accidentally, when she was in Nita's room. The bell buzzed in my room, and I come up to answer it, and Nita explained it to Miss Lewis." So that was why no attempt had been made to murder Nita while she slept, Dundee told himself triumphantly. For of course it was more than probable that Louis Dunlop had innocently spread the news of Nita's nervousness and her ingenious method of summoning help instantly. There was a knock at the door. "Come in. All finished, Carraway? Fine. I'd like to see the prints as soon as possible. And now I'd like you to go over to the morgue with Lydia and wait there until she has the body dressed in these clothes, and the hair done according to the instructions Mrs. Selim left. I'll leave the posing to you, but I want a full-length picture as well as a head portrait." As Lydia's work-roughened, knuckly hands were returning the funeral clothes to the suitcase, another question occurred to Dundee. "Lydia, did you know before I questioned you at the Miles home yesterday that Sprague had returned for that bag he had left in the bedroom upstairs?" Her scarred cheek flushed livid, but the maid answered with defiant honesty. "Yes, I did. He spoke to me through my basement window, just before you come running down to talk to me. He'd sneaked back, but he could tell from seeing your car outside that you was there, and he asked me to go up and get the bag and set it outside the kitchen door for him. I said I wouldn't do it. It was too risky." "Then you were pretending to be asleep when I entered your room?" "Yes, I was, but I had been asleep before Mr. Sprague called me. While you was ding-donging at me about Nita burning my face, I heard Mr. Sprague open the kitchen door. He had a key Nita had give him, so he could slip in unnoticed if he happened to come when Nita had other company. He didn't hardly make any noise at all, but I heard it because I was listening for it. You'd left the door to the basement stairs open, and my door too, so I heard him." "Did you hear him come down?" "Yes, I did. There's a board on the back stairs that squeaks, and I heard it plain, while you was still at me, hammer and thongs," Lydia answered. "He was in the house not more'n 2 minutes, all told, and when I figured he was safely out, I went upstairs with you to show you the presents I'd give Nita after she burned me, to prove I'd forgive her." "Why didn't you tell me, Lydia? Why did you protect Sprague? I know you don't like him," Dundee puzzled. "I wasn't thinking about him," Lydia told him flatly. "I was thinking about Nita. I didn't want any scandal on her, and I knew what the police and the newspapers would say if they found out Mr. Sprague had been staying all night sometimes." "Are you prepared to swear Sprague had time to do nothing but go up to the bedroom and get his bag?" "I am." When Lydia and Carraway had left together, Dundee rose and addressed the district attorney. "I'm going out to the Selim house now, to look for that secret hiding place where Roger Crane kept his securities, and which Judge Marshall evidently displayed to Nita as one of the charms of the house when she rented it." "Why not simply telephone Judge Marshall and ask him where and what it is?" Sanderson asked reasonably. "Do you think he'd tell?" Dundee retorted. "The old boy's no fool. Even if he didn't kill Nita himself and hide the gun there, my question would throw him into a panic of fear lest one of his best friends had done just that. No, I'll find it myself, if it's all right with you." But after a solid hour of hard and fruitless work, Bonnie Dundee was forced to admit ruefully to himself that his parting words to the district attorney might have been the youthful and empty boast that Sanderson had evidently considered them. For nowhere in the house Roger Crane had built and in which Nita Selim had been murdered could the detective find anything remotely resembling a concealed safe. The two plainclothes men whom Strawn had detailed to guard the house and to continue the search for the missing gun and silencer looked on with unconcealed amusement as Dundee tapped walls, floors and ceilings in a house that seemed to be exceptionally free of architectural eccentricities. Finally Dundee grew tired of their ribald comments and curtly ordered them to make a new and exhaustive search of the unused portions of the basement, those dark earth banks, with their overhead networks of water and drain pipes, heavily insulated cables of electric wires, cobwebby rafters and rough shelves holding empty fruit jars and liquor bottles, which contrasted sharply with the neatly ceiled and cement-floored space devoted to furnace, laundry and maid's room. Dundee himself had given those regions only a cursory inspection with his flashlight, for it was highly improbable that Nita Selim would have made use of a secret hiding place for her jewelry and valuable papers if that hiding place was located in such dark, awesome surroundings. No. The hiding place, if it really existed, and it must exist, had been within easy reach of Nita dressing and bedecking herself for a party, or Lydia Carr could not have been kept in complete ignorance of its location. With that conviction in mind, Dundee returned to Nita's bedroom, to which he had already devoted at least half an hour. Nothing in the big clothes closet, where Flora Miles had been hiding while Nita was being murdered. No secret doors in the desk, or dressing table, or bedside table. No false bottom in boudoir chair, or chaise longue. He had even taken every book out of the four-shelf bookcase which stood against the west wall near the north corner of the room, and had satisfied himself that no book was a leafless fake. His minute inspection of the bathroom and back hall, upon which Nita's bedroom opened, had proved as fruitless, although he had removed every drawer from the big linen press which stood in the hall, and measured spaces to a fraction of an inch. As for the walls, they were, except for the doors, unbroken expanses of tinted plaster. And yet... He stepped into the clothes closet again, hammer in hand for a fresh tapping of the cedar-board walls. Nothing here. And then he tapped again, his ear against the end wall of the closet, the wall farthest from the side porch. Yes, there was a faintly hollow echo of the hammer strokes. Excitement blazing high again, he took the tape measure with which he had provided himself on his way out, and calculated the strength of the closet from end to end. 6 feet. Emerging from the closet, he closed his eyes in an effort to recall in exact detail the architect's blueprint of the lower floor, which Coroner Price had submitted to his jury at the inquest that morning. Yes, that was right. The inner end wall of Nita's clothes closet was also the back of the guest closet in the little foyer that lay between Nita's bedroom and the main hall. Within 10 minutes, much laying on of the tape measure had produced a startling result. Instead of having a wall in common, the guest closet and Nita's clothes closet were separated by exactly 11 inches. Why the waste space? The blueprint, bearing the imprint of the architects Hammond and Hammond, showed no such walled-up cubbyhole. Exultantly, Dundee again entered Nita's closet and went over every inch of the narrow horizontal cedar boards which formed the end wall, but he met with no reward. Not through this workmanlike, solidly constructed wall had an opening been made. But in the fire closet he read a different story. Its back wall had an amateurish look. This closet was not cedar-lined, as was Nita's, but was painted throughout in soft ivory. But it was the back wall of the closet in which Dundee was interested. Unlike the other walls, which were of plaster, the back was constructed of 6-inch wide boards, the cheapness of the lumber not concealed by its coat of ivory paint. No self-respecting builder had put in that wall of broad, horizontal boards. And then, directly beneath the shelf, which was set regulation height, just above the pole on which swung a dozen coat hangers, Dundee found what he was looking for. A short length of the cheap board, a queer scrap to have been used even in so shoddy a job as that was, 8 inches long, and set square in the center of the wall, just below the shelf and pole. If he had not been looking for something odd, however, Dundee acknowledged to himself he would not have noticed it. Did anyone ever notice the back walls of closets? Sure of the result, he pressed with his fingertips upon the lower end of that short piece of board, and slowly it swung inward, the top slanting outward. He had found the secret hiding place, and Dundee silently agreed with Judge Marshall that it was the simplest and most ingenious arrangement you ever saw, for it was nothing more nor less than a shelf set between the two closets, in those 11 inches of unaccounted-for space. "I take off my hat to Roger Crane," Dundee reflected. "No burglar in the world would ever have thought of pressing upon a short piece of board in a fire closet in search of a safe. But how did Judge Marshall know of its existence?" The only answer Dundee could think of was that Crane, overseeing the building of his house, had suddenly conceived this brilliant and simple plan, and had tipped one of the carpenters to carry it out for him. Possibly, or probably, he had bragged to Clive or Ralph Hammond, his architects, of his clever invention, and the Hammond boys had passed on the information to Judge Marshall when, after Crane's failure and flight, the house had become the property of the ex-judge. These thoughts rushed through his mind as his flashlight explored the shelf through the tilted opening. The gun and silencer must be here, since they could be no place else. But the shelf was bare, except for a small brass box, fastened only by a clasp. In his acute disappointment, Dundee took little interest in the collection of pretty but inexpensive jewelry, Nita's trinkets undoubtedly, which the brass box contained. No wedding ring among them. In spite of his chagrin at not finding the gun, Dundee studied the simple mechanism which Roger Crane's ingenuity had conceived. From the outside, the 8-inch length of wood board fitted smoothly, giving no indication whatever that it was otherwise than what it seemed, part of a cheaply built wall. But Dundee's flashlight played upon the beveled edges of both the short board and the two neighboring planks between which it was fitted. The pivoting arrangement was of the simplest, the small nickel-plated pieces being set into the short board and the other two planks with small screws which did not pierce the painted outside surface. His curiosity satisfied, Dundee stepped out of the closet into the tiny foyer. He was about to leave when a terrific truth crashed through his mind and froze his feet to the floor. Of course the gun and silencer were not there. This was the guest closet. In it had hung the hat of every person who had been Nita's guest, either for bridge or cocktails, that fatal Saturday afternoon. And to this closet to retrieve hat, stick, or, in the case of the woman, summer coat and hat, had come every person who had been questioned and then searched by the police. Dundee tried to recapture the picture of the stampede which had followed upon his permission for all guests to go to their homes. But it was useless. He had stayed in the living room with Strawn, had taken not the slightest interest in the scramble for hats, coats, and sticks. For Strawn had previously assured him that the guest closet had been thoroughly searched. So quickly that he felt slightly dizzy, Dundee's thoughts raced around the new discovery. This changed everything, of course. Any one of half a dozen persons could have arrived with a gun and silencer, not screwed together, of course, because of the ungainly length, and seized the opportunity presented by Nita's being alone in her bedroom to shoot her. What easier, then, than to hide the weapon on this secret shelf, the door of which yielded to the slightest pressure? And what easier than to retrieve the weapon after permission had been granted to all to return to their homes? Easy enough to manage to go alone to the closet for a hat, the extra minute of time unnoticed in the general excitement. It had been vitally necessary, too, to retrieve the weapon, since any innocent member of that party might have remembered later to mention the secret hiding place to the police, secret no longer since Judge Marshall had gossiped about it. Then another thought boiled up and demanded attention. In the new theory, what place did the bang or bump have? That noise which Flora Miles, concealed in Nita's closet, had dimly heard. Dundee had been positive, when Lydia had discovered the shattered electric bulb in the big bronze lamp, that its position in Nita's room indicated the progress of the flight of the murderer. Flight diagonally across the room toward the back hall. But now... A little dashed, Dundee returned to the bedroom. The big lamp was where he had first seen it, about a foot beyond the window nearest the porch, and at the head of the chaise longue which was set between the two west windows, where, according to Lydia, the lamp always stood. The too long cord lay slackly along the floor near the west wall, and extended to the double outlet on the baseboard behind the bookcase. A slack cord! Down on his hands and knees Dundee went, to peer under the low-bottom shelf of the bookcase. Yes, the pronged plug of the lamp cord had been jerked almost out of the baseboard outlet. It was easy to visualize what had happened. The murderer, after firing the shot, had involuntarily taken a step or even several steps backward until his foot had caught in the loop of electric cord, causing the big lamp to be thrown violently against the wall near which it stood. But who? Any one of half a dozen people. But who? End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Murder at Bridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Katie Giboney. Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen. Chapter 19. Having ticketed the big bronze lamp, which he had brought with him from the Selim house, and locked it away in the room devoted to exhibits for the state, Bonnie Dundee hurried into Penny's office, primed with the news of his discovery of the secret hiding place, and eager to lay his new theory before the district attorney. "Bill's gone," Penny interrupted her swift typing to inform him, "to Chicago. He had only 15 minutes to make the 3 o'clock train after he received a wire saying his mother is not expected to live. He tried to reach you at the Selim house, but one of Captain Strawn's men said you had left." "I stopped on my way in to get a bite to eat," Dundee explained mechanically. "I dashed off without my lunch, you know." "Did you find the gun and silencer?" Penny asked. "No. Whoever used it Saturday afternoon walked out of the house with it, in plain view of the police, and still has it. Very convenient, too, in case another murder seems to be expedient or amusing." "Don't joke," Penny shuddered. "But what in the world do you mean?" Briefly Dundee told her, minimizing the hard work, the concentrated thinking, and the meticulous use of a tape measure which had resulted in the discovery of the shelf between Nita's bedroom closet and the guest closet in the little foyer. "I see," Penny agreed, her husky voice slow and weighted with horror. She sat in dazed thought for a minute. "That rather brings it home to my crowd, doesn't it? To think that Dad, probably everyone at the party, except me, had heard all about Dad's simple and ingenious arrangement for hiding the securities he sent on to New York before he ran away. And no outsiders, nobody but us, had a legitimate excuse for entering that closet. Not even Dexter Sprague. It's one of his affectations not to wear a hat." "Is it?" Dundee pounced. "You're sure he wore no hat that afternoon? Did you notice him when he left, after I had dismissed you all?" "Yes," Penny acknowledged honestly. "I paid attention to him because I was hating him so. I believed then that he was the murderer, and I was furious with you and Captain Strawn for not arresting him. He was the first to leave. Just walked straight out. Wouldn't even stop to talk with Janet Raymond, who was trying to get a word with him. I saw him start toward Sheridan Road, walking. He had no car, you know." "Did you observe the others?" Dundee demanded eagerly. "Do you know who went alone to the guest closet?" Penny shook her head. "Everybody was milling around in the hall, and I paid no attention. Lois said she would drive me home, and then I went in to ask you to let me stay behind with you. I remember." "Listen, Penny. I'm going to tell you something else that nobody knows yet but Sanderson, Lydia, and me. I don't have to ask you not to tell any of your friends. You know well enough that anything you learn from either Sanderson or me is strictly confidential." Penny nodded, her face very white and her brown eyes big with misery. "I have every reason to believe that Nita Selim was a blackmailer, that she came to Hamilton for the express purpose of bleeding someone she had known before, or someone on whom she had the goods from some underworld source or other. At any rate, Nita banked 10,000 mysterious dollars, 5,000 on April 28th and 5,000 on May 5th. I talked to Drake last night, and I have his word for it that the money was in bills of varying denomination, none large, when Nita presented it for deposit. Therefore it seems clear to me that Nita got the money right here in Hamilton. Otherwise it would have come to her in the form of checks or drafts or money orders. And it seems equally clear to me that she did not bring that large amount of cash from New York with her, or she would have deposited it in a lump sum in the bank immediately after her arrival." "Yes," Penny agreed. "But why are you telling me? Of course I'm interested." "Because I want you to tell me the financial status of each of your friends," Dundee said gently. "I know how hard it is for you." "You could find out from others, so I might as well tell you," Penny interrupted, with a weary shrug. "Judge Marshall is well to do, and Karen's father her mother is dead settled $100,000 on her when she married. She has complete control of her own money. The Dunlaps are the richest people in Hamilton, and have been for 2 or 3 generations. Lois was first family, but poor when she married Peter, but he's been giving her an allowance of $20,000 per year for several years. Not for running the house, but for her personal use, clothes, charities, hobbies, like the little theater she brought Nita here to organize." "I wouldn't say she spends a great deal of it on dress," Dundee interrupted with a grin. "Lois doesn't give a hang how she looks or what anyone thinks of her, which is probably one reason she is the best loved woman in our crowd," Penny retorted loyally. "The Mileses' money is really Flora's, and she has the reputation of being one of the shrewdest business men in town. When she married Tracey nearly 8 years ago, he was just a salesman in her father's business, the biggest dairy in the state, Clover Blossom butter, cream, milk and cheese, you know. Well, when Flora married Tracey, her father retired and let Tracey run the business for Flora, and he's still managing it, but Flora is the real head. Now let's see. Oh yes, the Drakes. Johnny is vice president of the Hamilton National Bank, as you know, and owns a big block of the stock. Carolyn has no money of her own except what Johnny gives her, and I rather think he isn't any too generous." "They don't get along very well together, do they?" "No," Penny agreed reluctantly. "You see, Johnny Drake was simply not cut out for love and marriage. He's a born ascetic, would have been a monk 2 or 3 centuries ago, but he cares as much for Carolyn as he could for any woman. The Hammond boys have some inherited money, and Clive has made a big financial success of architecture. That leaves only Janet and Polly, doesn't it? Polly's an orphan and has barrels of money, and will have barrels more when her aunt, with whom she lives, dies and leaves her the fortune she has always promised her." "And Janet Raymond?" "Janet's father is pretty rich, owns a big wire fence factory. But Janet has only a reasonable allowance," Penny answered. "As for me, I'm very rich. I get $35 whole a week to support myself and Mother on." Dundee remained thoughtfully silent for a long minute. Then, "All you girls are alumnae of Forsyte on the Hudson, and Nita Selim came here immediately after she had directed a Forsyte play. Tell me, Penny, was any of the Hamilton girls ever in disgrace while in the Forsyte school?" Penny's face flamed. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but so far as I know, there was never anything of the sort. Of course, we all graduated different years, except Karen and I might not have heard. But no!" she denied vehemently. "There wasn't any scandal on a Hamilton girl ever. I'm sure of it." But her very vehemence convinced Bonnie Dundee that she was not at all sure. He looked at his watch. 4 o'clock. By this time Nita Selim, tiny, cold body, royal blue velvet dress, black curls piled high in an old-fashioned French roll, bullet-torn heart, were nothing more than a little heap of gray ashes. Would Lydia Carr have them put in a sealed urn and carry them about with her always? "I'm going out now, Penny, and I shan't be back today," he told the girl, who had returned to her furious typing. "I'll telephone in about an hour to see if anything has come up. By the way, how do I get to the Dunlap house?" "It's in the Brentwood section. You know, that cluster of hills around Mirror Lake. Most of the crowd live out there. The Drakes, the Mileses, the Beals, the Marshalls. The Dunlap house stands on the highest hill of all. It's gray stone, a little like a French chateau. We used to live out there too, in a colonial house my mother's father built. But Dad persuaded Mother to sell, when he went into that Primrose Meadows venture. The Raymonds bought it. But why do you want to see Lois?" "Thanks much, Penny. I don't know what I should do without you," Dundee said, without answering her question, and reached for his hat. After 10 minutes of driving, the last mile of which had circled a smooth silver coin of a lake, Dundee stopped his car and let his eyes rove appreciatively. He had made this trip the day before to question Lydia, already installed as nurse for the Miles children, but he had been in too great a hurry then to see much of this section consecrated to Hamilton's socially elect. Georgian cottage, Spanish hacienda, Italian villa, Tudor mansion, that was the Miles home, colonial mansion where Penny had once lived. Gray stone chateau, not one of them blatantly new or marked with the dollar sign. Dundee sighed a little enviously as he turned his car into the winding driveway that led up to the highest hill to the Dunlap home. Lois Dunlap betrayed no surprise when the butler led Dundee to the flag-stoned upper terrace overlooking Mirror Lake, where she was having tea with her 3 children and their governess. For a moment the detective had the illusion that he was in England again. "How do you do, Mr. Dundee? This is Miss Burden, my 3 offspring, Peter the Third, Eleanor, and Bobby. Will you please take the children to the playroom now, Miss Burden?" "Thank you. Tea, Mr. Dundee, or shall I order you a highball?" "Nothing, thanks," Dundee answered, grateful for her friendliness but nonplussed by it. Not for the first time he felt a sick distaste for the profession he had chosen. "It's all over," Lois Dunlap said in a low voice, as the butler retreated. "Lydia made her look very beautiful. I thought it would be rather horrible, having to see her, as the poor child requested in her note to Lydia, but I'm glad now I did. She looked as sweet and young and innocent as she must have been when she first wore the royal blue velvet." "I'm glad," Dundee said sincerely. Then he leaned toward her across the tea table. "Mrs. Dunlap, will you please tell me just how you persuaded Mrs. Selim to come to Hamilton, so far from Broadway?" "Why, certainly." Lois Dunlap looked puzzled. "But it really did not take much persuasion after I showed her some group photographs we had made when we Forsyte girls put on the Beggars' Opera here last October, a benefit performance for the Forsyte Alumnae Scholarship Fund." With difficulty, Dundee controlled his excitement. "May I see those photographs, please?" "I had to hunt quite a bit for them," his hostess apologized 10 minutes later, as she spread the glossy prints of half a dozen photographs for Dundee's inspection. "Do you know the Beggars' Opera? John Gay, 18th century, isn't it? As I remember it, it is quite " Dundee hesitated, grinning. "Bawdy?" Lois laughed. "Oh, very! We couldn't have got away with it if it hadn't been a classic. As it was, we had to tone down some of the naughtiest passages and songs. But it was lots of fun, and the boys enjoyed it hugely because it gave them an opportunity to wear tight satin breeches and lace ruffles. This is my husband Peter. He adored being the highwayman, Robin of Bagshot," and she pointed out a stocky, belligerent-looking man near the end of the long row of costumed players, in a photograph which showed the entire cast. "You say that Mrs. Selim accepted your proposal after she saw these photographs?" Dundee asked. "Had she refused before?" "Yes. I'd gone to New York for the annual Easter play, which the Forsyte School puts on, because I'm intensely interested in semi-professional theatricals," Lois explained. "Nita had done a splendid job with the play the year before, and I spoke to her, after this year's show was over, about coming to Hamilton. She was not at all interested, but polite and sweet about it, so I invited her to have lunch with me the next day, and showed her these photographs of our own play, in the hope that they would make her take the idea more seriously. We had borrowed a little theater director from Chicago, and I knew we had done a really good job of The Beggar's Opera. The local reviews " "These stills look extremely professional. I don't wonder that they interested Nita," Dundee cut in. "Will you tell me what she said?" "She rather startled me," Lois Dunlap confessed. "At first I showed her this picture of the whole cast, and as I was explaining the play a bit she didn't know The Beggar's Opera she almost snatched the photograph out of my hands. As she studied it, her lovely black eyes grew perfectly enormous. I've never seen her so excited since." "What did she say?" Dundee interrupted tensely. "Why, she said nothing just at first. Then she began to laugh in the queerest way, almost hysterically. I asked her why she was laughing. I was a little huffy, I'm afraid. And she said the men looked so adorably conceited and funny. Then she began to ask the names of the players. I told her that McKeith, he's the highwayman hero, you know, was played by Clive Hammond, that my Peter was Robin of Bagshot, that Johnny Drake was another highwayman, Mat of the Mint, that Tracy Miles played the jailer, Lockett." "Did she show more interest in one name than another?" "Yes. When I pointed out Judge Marshall as Peachum, the fence, she cried out suddenly, 'Why, I know him! I met him once on a party " "Is he really a judge?" And she laughed as if she knew something very funny about Hugo, as no doubt she did. He was an inveterate lady killer before his marriage, as you may have heard. "Do you think her first excitement was over seeing Judge Marshall among the players?" Dundee asked. "No," Lois answered, after considering a moment. "I'm sure she didn't notice him until I pointed him out. The face in this group that seemed to interest her the most was Flora Miles. Flora played the part of Lucy Lockett, the jailer's daughter, and Karen Marshall the other feminine lead, Polly Peachum, you know. But it was Flora's picture she lingered over, so I showed her this picture," and Lois Dunlap reached for the portrait of Flora Miles, unexpectedly beautiful in the 18th century costume, tight bodice and billowing skirts. "She questioned you about Mrs. Miles?" Dundee asked. "Yes, all sorts of questions. Her name, and whether she was married, and then who her husband was, and if she had had stage experience," Lois answered conscientiously. She explained her interest by saying Flora looked more like a professional actress than any of the others, and that we should give her a real chance when we got our little theater going. I asked her if that meant she was going to accept my offer, and she said she might, but that she would have to talk it over with a friend first. Just before midnight she telephoned me at my hotel that she had decided to accept the job." Dundee's heart leaped. It was very easy to guess who that "friend" was, but he controlled his excitement, asked his next question casually. "Did she show particular interest in any other player?" "Yes. She asked a number of questions about Polly Beale, and seemed incredulous when I told her that Polly and Clive were engaged. Polly played Mrs. Peachum and was a riot in the part, but Nita's intuition was correct. Flora carried off the acting honors. Oh, yes. She also asked, quite naively, if all my friends were rich, too, and could help support a little theater. I reassured her on that point. And," Dundee reflected silently, "upon a point much more important to Nita Selim. Aloud he said, 'I don't see you among the cast.'" "Oh, I haven't a grain of talent," Lois Dunlap laughed. "I can't act for 2 cents. Can I, Peter darling? Here's the redoubtable Robin of Bagshot in person, Mr. Dundee, my husband." The detective rose to shake hands with the man he had been too absorbed to see or hear approaching. "You're the man from the district attorney's office?" Peter Dunlap scowled, his hand barely touching Dundee's. "I suppose you're trying to get at the bottom of the mystery of why my wife brought that Selim woman " "Don't call her that Selim woman, Peter," Lois Dunlap interrupted with more sharpness than Dundee had ever seen her display. "You never liked the poor girl, were never just to her." "Well, it looks as if my hunch was correct, doesn't it?" the stocky, rugged-faced man retorted. "I told you at the beginning to pay her off and send her back to New York." "You knew I couldn't do that, even to please you, dear," Lois said. "But please don't let's quarrel about poor Nita again. She's dead now, and I want to do anything I can to help bring her murderer to justice." "There's nothing you can do, Lois, and I hope Mr. Dundee will not find it necessary to quiz you again." Dundee reached for his hat. "I hope so too, Mr. Dunlap. By the way, you are president of the Chamber of Commerce, aren't you?" "Yes, I am, and we're having a meeting tonight, at which that Sprague man's bid on making a historical movie of Hamilton will be turned down unanimously. Now that the Selim woman isn't here to vamp my fellow members into doing anything she wants, I think I can safely promise you that Dexter Sprague will have no further business in Hamilton, unless it's police business." "Thanks for the tip, Mr. Dunlap," Dundee said evenly. "I hope you enjoyed your fishing trip. Where do you fish, sir?" "A tactful way of asking for my alibi, eh?" Dunlap was heavily sarcastic. "I left Friday afternoon for my own camp in the mountains, up in the northwest part of the state. I drove my own car, went alone, spent the weekend alone, and got back this noon. I read of the murder in a paper I picked up in a village on my way home. I didn't like Nita Selim, and I don't give a damn about her being murdered, except that my wife's name is in all the papers. Any questions?" "None, thanks," Dundee answered curtly, then turned to Lois Dunlap, who was watching the two men with troubled, embarrassed eyes. "I am very grateful to you, Mrs. Dunlap, for your kindness." The detective's angry resentment of Peter Dunlap's attitude lasted until he had circled Mirror Lake and was on the road into Hamilton. Then common sense intervened. Dunlap was undoubtedly devoted to his wife. Penny had said that he had never looked at another woman. It was rather more than natural that he should be in a futile, blustering rage at the outcome of Lois's friendship for the little Broadway dancer. Free of anger, his mind reverted to the story Lois Dunlap had told him, for in it, he was sure, was hidden the key to the mystery of Nita Selim's murder. Not at all interested in the proposition to organize a little theater in Hamilton, Nita had been seized with a strange excitement as soon as she was shown photographs of a large group of Hamilton's richest and most prominent inhabitants. But there was the rub, a large group. Would that group of possible suspects never narrow down to one? Of course there was Judge Marshall, but if Lois Dunlap's memory was to be trusted, Nita had not noticed the elderly Beau Brummell's picture until after that strange hysterical excitement had taken possession of her. And if it had been Judge Marshall whom she had come to Hamilton to blackmail, would Nita not have guarded her tongue before Lois? The same was true about her extraordinary interest in Flora Miles. Dundee tried to put himself in Nita's place, confronted suddenly with a group picture containing the likeness of a person, man or woman, against whom she knew something so dreadful and so secret that her silence would be worth thousands of dollars. Would he have chattered of that very person? No, of anyone else but that particular person. It was easy to picture Nita, her head whirling with possibilities, hitting upon the most conspicuous player in the group, dark, tense, theatrical Flora, already pointed out to her as one of the two female leads in the opera. But of whom had she really been thinking? Again a blank wall, for in that group photograph of the cast of the Beggars' Opera had appeared every man, woman, and girl who had been Nita's guest on the day of her murder. Dundee, paying more attention to his driving now that he was in the business section of the city, saw ahead of him the second-rate hotel where Dexter Sprague had been living since Nita had wired him to join her in Hamilton. On a sudden impulse, the detective parked his car in front of the hotel, and 5 minutes later was knocking upon Sprague's door. "Well, what do you want now?" the unshaven, pallid man demanded ungraciously. Dundee stepped into the room and closed the door. I want you to tell me the name of the man Nita Selim came here to blackmail, Sprague." "Blackmail?" Sprague echoed, his pallid cheeks going more yellow. "You're crazy! Nita came here to take a job." "She came here to blackmail someone, and I am convinced that she sent for you to act as a partner in her scheme. No, wait. I'm convinced, I tell you," Dundee assured him grimly. "But I'll make a trade with you, in behalf of the district attorney. Tell me the name of the person she blackmailed, and I will promise you immunity from prosecution as her accomplice. Get out of my room." And Dexter Sprague's right forefinger trembled violently as it pointed toward the door in a melodramatic gesture. "Very well, Sprague," Dundee said. "But let me give you a friendly warning. Don't try to carry on the good work. Nita got $10,000, but she also got a bullet through her heart, and the gun which fired that bullet is safely back in the hands of the killer. You're not going to get that movie job, and I was just afraid you might be tempted. Good afternoon." End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Murder at Bridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Carl, St. Louis, Missouri, September 2007. Murder at Bridge by Anne Austen. Chapter 20. It was Wednesday evening, 4 whole days since Nita Leigh Selim, Broadway dancer, had been murdered while she was dummy at bridge. Plainclothesmen in pairs, day and night shifts, still guarded the lonely house in Primrose Meadows, but Dundee had taken no interest in the actual scene of the crime since Carraway, fingerprint expert, had reported negatively upon the secret shelf between Nita's bedroom closet and the guest closet. As far as any tangible evidence went, only Dundee's fingers had pressed upon the pivoting panel and explored the narrow shelf. The very lack of fingerprints had of course confirmed Dundee's belief that the murderer's hand had pressed upon that swinging panel, had quested in vain for the incriminating documents or letters which had been the basis of Nita's blackmail scheme, had deposited upon the shelf the gun and silencer with which the murder had been accomplished, and had later retrieved the weapon in perfect safety. A hand loosely wrapped in a handkerchief or protected by a glove. The hand of a cunning, careful, cold-blooded murderer. Or murderess. But who? Who? Bonnie Dundee, brooding at his desk in the living room of his small apartment, reflected bitterly that he was no nearer the answer to that question than he had been an hour after Nita Selim's death. "Well, my dear Watson," he addressed his caged parrot finally. "What do you say? Who killed Nita Selim?" The parrot stirred on his perch, thrust out his hooked beak to nip his master's prodding finger, then disdainfully turned his back. "I don't blame you, Captain," Dundee chuckled. "You must be as sick of that question as I am. And what a pity it ever had to be asked! If the murderer had not been so hasty, or so pressed for time that he really could not wait to listen to Nita, he would have learned from Nita herself that she had decided to be a very good girl, and had burned the papers, all because she was genuinely in love with Ralph Hammond. One comfort we have, my dear Watson, the murderer still does not know that Nita burned the papers Friday night. Sooner or later, when he believes police vigilance has been relaxed, he'll go prowling about that house, and to Captain Strawn, who doesn't take the slightest stock in my theory, will go credit for the arrest. Unless—" Dundee reached for a telegraph form, and again scanned the penciled message. Only that afternoon had it occurred to him to ask the telegraph company for a copy of the wire by which Dexter Sprague, according to his own story, had been summoned to Hamilton by Nita Selim. The manager had been obliging, and had looked up the message and copied it with his own hand. It was a night letter, and had been filed in Hamilton, April 24th, the 3rd day after Nita's arrival, addressed to Dexter Sprague at a hotel in the theatrical district, New York City. The message read: "Everything Jake so far, but would feel safer you here. Chamber of Commerce planning booster movie founding and development of Hamilton looking good. Director, why not try for job as good excuse? All my love, Nita. Dundee laid the paper on his desk, locked his hands behind his head, and addressed the parrot again. The habit of using the bird for an audience, and as an excuse for puzzling and mulling aloud, had grown on him during the year he had owned the doughty old captain. As I was about to say, my dear Watson, Captain Strawn's boys out at the Selim house will have the chance to nab our man, or woman, unless Dexter Sprague ignores my warning, pretends to have the papers himself, and tries to carry on the blackmail scheme, which he undoubtedly knew all about, and which, most probably, he encouraged Nita to undertake. The friend she had to consult, you know, before she decided to accept Lois Dunlap's offer. The parrot interrupted with a hoarse cackle. "Have you gone over to the enemy, Captain?" Dundee reproved the bird. "You sound exactly like Strawn when he laughed at my interpretation of this message this afternoon. My late chief contends, and it is just possible, of course, that he is right, that Nita was afraid she couldn't swing the job of organizing and directing Lois's little theater, and wanted Sprague here, both as lover and unofficial assistant. But that's a pretty thin explanation, don't you think, my dear Watson?" "Oh, all right, laugh, damn you, but I'd feel better if Strawn had taken my advice and set a Dick to trail Sprague, to see that he keeps out of mischief. All this, however, gets us no nearer to answering that eternal question: who?" With a deep sigh, the troubled young special investigator reached for the timetable he had drafted from his notes made during the grisly replaying of the death hand at bridge, and scanned it again. 5:20. Flora Miles, dummy. Table number 1, leaves living room to telephone. 5:22. Clive Hammond arrives and goes directly into solarium. 5:23. End of rubber at table number 1. Players: Polly Beale, Janet Raymond, Lois Dunlap, Flora Miles, dummy. Polly Beale leaves living room to join Clive Hammond in solarium. 5:24. Janet Raymond leaves room, says she went straight to front porch. 5:25. Tracy Miles parks car at curb, walks up to the house, hangs up hat in clothes closet, and, at his estimate. 5:27. Miles enters living room, talks with Nita, who, as dummy, has just laid down her cards at table number 2. Players: Karen Marshall, Penny Crane, Carolyn Drake. 5:28. Nita leaves the living room, goes to her bedroom to make up. 5:28. Half. Lois Dunlap and Miles go into dining room, Miles to make cocktails. 5:31. Judge Marshall enters living room, interrupts bridge game. 5:33. John C. Drake enters living room, having walked from Country Club, which he says he left at 5:10, and which is only 3/4 of a mile from the Selim house. 5:36. Karen finishes playing of hand, and Dexter Sprague and Janet Raymond enter from front porch, proceeding into dining room. 5:37. Penny Crane finishes scoring, and Karen leaves room to tell Nita the score. 5:38. Karen screams upon discovering the dead body at the dressing table. Dundee laid aside the typed sheet and reached for another, the typing of which was perfect, since Penny's efficient fingers had manipulated the keys. When he had telephoned to the office just before 5 o'clock Monday afternoon to see if anything had come up, Dundee had learned from Penny that Peter Dunlap had issued an informal call to "the crowd" for a meeting at his home that evening. "You're going, of course?" Dundee had asked. "Then, during the discussion of the case, I wish you'd try to get the answers to some questions which need clearing up, if you can do so without getting yourself 'in Dutch' with your friends. Fine? Got a pencil? Here goes." And now he was rereading the report she had conscientiously written and left on his desk Tuesday morning. Peter, declaring he wanted to get at the bottom of this case, presided almost like a judge on the bench, and asked nearly every question you wanted the answer to. Everyone in the crowd adores gruff old Peter, and no one dreamed of resenting his barrage of questions. What a detective he would make! First, Janet admitted that she did not go directly to the front porch when she left the living room after her table finished the last rubber. Went first to the hall lavatory to comb her hair and renew her makeup. Said she was there alone about 5 minutes, then went to the front porch. revised her story after Tracy had said he did not see her on the porch when he arrived. Second, Judge Marshall said he glanced into the living room when he arrived, saw Karen, Carolyn, and me absorbed in our game, and went on down the hall to hang up his hat and stick. Proceeded immediately to the living room. Third, John Drake told Peter he entered the front hall and passed on to the laboratory to wash up, felt sticky after his walk from the country club, hung up hat in the guest closet, went to living room within 3 minutes after reaching the house. Fourth, Polly and Clive told Peter that they stayed together in the solarium the whole time, stationed at a front window, watching for Ralph. When Peter asked them if they could confirm Judge Marshall's story and Johnny Drake's story, they said they had seen them both arrive, but had paid no attention to them after they were in the house. It occurred to Peter, too, to wonder if either Polly or Clive went to Nita's room to warn her that Ralph knew about Sprague's having slept the night before in the upstairs bedroom. They both denied emphatically that they had done so. Fifth, Judge Marshall, the pompous old darling, still smarting under the insinuations you made about him and Nita right after the murder, volunteered the information to Peter that Nita had not paid her rent, on the plea that she was short of funds, and that he had told her to let it go until it was quite convenient. Sixth, the word blackmail was not mentioned, and Johnny Drake, because of professional ethics I suppose, did not tell about Nita's 2 deposits of $5,000 each in his bank. Seventh, the secret shelf in the foyer closet was not mentioned. Peter's verdict, after he got through with us, was that only Sprague could have done it, using the gun and silencer which Nita herself had stolen from Hugo. I couldn't tell him that you are convinced that Lydia's alibi for him is a genuine one, for apparently Lydia hasn't told either Flora or Tracy that she was able to furnish Sprague an alibi. And that's all, except that Peter asked me to convey to you his apologies for his rudeness Monday afternoon. Penelope Crane. With a deep sigh, Dundee laid Penny's report aside. "And that does seem to be all, my dear Watson," he told the parrot. "Exactly 6 possible suspects, and not an atom of actual evidence against one of them, except that Judge Marshall owned the gun. 6, count 'em: Judge Marshall, John Drake, Flora Miles, Clive Hammond, Polly Beale, Janet Raymond. Every single one of them a possible victim of blackmail, since the girls all attended the Forsyte School, where Nita directed the Easter play for 2 years, and since the men make several trips a year to New York. 6 people, all of whom probably knew of the existence of the secret shelf. 6 people who knew Nita was in her bedroom, either from having seen her go, or from hearing her powder box tinkling its damnable tune. Yes, Penny, you're right. That's all, so far as Hamilton is concerned. If Sanderson won't let me go to New York, which is where this damn business started, I'll resign and go out on my own, without wasting another day here." But Dundee did not go to New York the next morning. He was far too busy in Hamilton. End of chapter 20.